From his own lines, Jackson passed along the front, drawing the fire of the Federal skirmishers who were creeping forward, and proceeded to the centre of the position, where, on the eminence which has since borne the name of Lee's Hill, the commander-in-chief, surrounded by his generals, was giving his last instructions. It was past 9 o'clock. The sun, shining out with almost September warmth, was drawing up the mist which hid the opposing armies, and as the dense white folds dissolved and rolled away, the Confederates saw the broad plain beneath them dark with more than 80,000 foes. Of these, the left wing, commanded by Franklin, and composed of 55,000 men and 116 guns, were moving against the Second Corps. 30,000 under Sumner were forming for attack on Longstreet, and from the heights of Stafford, where the reserves were posted in dense masses, a great storm of shot and shell burst upon the Confederate lines. "For once," says Dabney, "war unmasked its terrible proportions with a distinctness hitherto unknown in the forest-clad landscapes of America, and the plain of Fredericksburg presented a panorama that was dreadful in its grandeur." It was then that Longstreet, to whose sturdy heart the approach of battle seemed always welcome, said to Jackson, "General, do not all those multitudes of Federals frighten you? We shall very soon see whether I shall not frighten them." And with this grim reply, the commander of the Second Corps rode back to meet Franklin's onset. 9 a.m. The Federals were already advancing. From Deep Run southward, for more than a mile and a half, 3 great lines of battle, accompanied by numerous batteries, moved steadily forward, powerful enough, to all appearance, to bear down all opposition by sheer weight of numbers. "On they came," says an eyewitness, "in beautiful order, as if on parade, their bayonets glistening in the bright sunlight. On they came, waving their hundreds of regimental flags, which relieved with warm bits of colouring the dull blue of the columns and the russet tinge of the wintry landscape, while their artillery beyond the river continued the cannonade with unabated fury over their heads, and gave a background of white fleecy smoke like midsummer clouds to the animated picture. And yet that vast array, so formidable of aspect, lacked that moral force without which physical power, even in its most terrible form, is but an idle show. Not only were the strength of the Confederate position, the want of energy in the preliminary movements, the insecurity of their own situation, but too apparent to the intelligence of the regimental officers and men, but they mistrusted their commander. Northern writers have recorded that the Army of the Potomac never went down to battle with less alacrity than on this day at Fredericksburg. Nor was the order of attack of such a character as to revive the confidence of the troops. Burnside, deluded by the skill with which Jackson had hidden his troops into the belief that the Second Army Corps was still at Port Royal, had instructed Franklin to seize the ridge with a single division, and Meade's 4,500 Pennsylvanians were sent forward alone, while the remainder of the Grand Division, over 50,000 strong, stood halted on the plain, awaiting the result of this hopeless manoeuvre. Meade advanced in 3 lines, each of a brigade, with skirmishers in front and on the flank, and his progress was soon checked. No sooner had his first line crossed the Richmond road than the left was assailed by a well-directed and raking artillery fire. Captain Pelham, commanding Stuart's horse artillery, had galloped forward by Jackson's orders with his 2 rifled guns, and, escorted by a dismounted squadron, had come into action beyond a marshy stream which ran through a tangled ravine on the Federal flank. So telling was his fire that the leading brigade wavered and gave ground, and though Meade quickly brought up his guns and placed his 3rd Brigade en potence in support, he was unable to continue his forward movement until he had brushed away his audacious antagonist. The 4 Pennsylvania batteries were reinforced by 2 others, but rapidly changing his position as often as the Federal gunners found his range, for more than half an hour Pelham defied their efforts, and for that space of time arrested the advance of Meade's 4,500 infantry. One of his pieces was soon disabled, but with the remaining gun, captured from the enemy 6 months before, he maintained the unequal fight until his limbers were empty, and he received peremptory orders from Stuart to withdraw. On Pelham's retirement, Franklin, bringing several batteries forward to the Richmond road, for more than half an hour subjected the woods before him to a heavy cannonade, in which the guns on the Stafford Heights played a conspicuous part. Hidden, however, by the thick timber, Jackson's regiments lay secure, unharmed by the tempest that crashed above them through the leafless branches, and, reserving their fire for the hostile infantry, his guns were silent. The general, meanwhile, according to his custom, had walked far out into the fields to reconnoitre for himself, and luck favoured the Confederacy on this day of battle. Lieutenant Smith was his only companion, and a Federal sharpshooter, suddenly rising from some tall weeds 200 paces distant, levelled his rifle and fired. The bullet whistled between their heads, and Jackson, turning with a smile to his aide-de-camp, said cheerfully, "Mr. Smith, had you not better go to the rear? They may shoot you." Then, having deliberately noted the enemy's arrangements, he returned to his station on Prospect Hill. 11:15 a.m. It was past 11 before Meade resumed his advance. Covered by the fire of the artillery, his first line was within 800 yards of Jackson's centre, when suddenly the silent woods awoke to life. The Confederate batteries, pushing forward from the covert, came rapidly into action, and the flash and thunder of more than 50 guns revealed to the astonished Federals the magnitude of the task they had undertaken. From front and flank came the scathing fire. The skirmishers were quickly driven in, and on the closed ranks behind burst the full fury of the storm. Dismayed and decimated by this fierce and unexpected onslaught, Meade's brigades broke in disorder and fell back to the Richmond road. For the next hour and a half, an artillery duel, in which over 400 guns took part, raged over the whole field, and the Confederate batteries, their position at last revealed, engaged with spirit the more numerous and powerful ordnance of the enemy. Then Franklin brought up 3 divisions to Meade's support, and from the smouldering ruins of Fredericksburg, 3 miles to the northward, beyond the high trees of Hazel Run, the deep columns of Sumner's. Grand Division deployed under the fire of Longstreet's guns. Sumner's attack had been for some time in progress before Franklin was in readiness to cooperate. The battle was now fully developed, and the morning mists had been succeeded by dense clouds of smoke, shrouding bill and plain, through which the cannon flashed redly, and the defiant yells of Longstreet's riflemen, mingled with their rattling volleys, stirred the pulses of Jackson's veterans. As the familiar sounds were borne to their ears, it was seen that the dark lines beyond the Richmond road were moving forward, and the turn of the Second Corps had come. 1 p.m. It was 1 o'clock, and Jackson's guns had for the moment ceased their fire. Meade's Pennsylvanians had rallied. Gibbon's division had taken post on their right. Biney and Newton were in support, and Doubleday, facing south, was engaged with Stuart's dismounted troopers. 21 guns on the right and 30 on the left, stationed on the Richmond road, 1,000 yards from the Confederate position, formed a second tier to the heavier pieces on the heights and fired briskly on the woods. Preceded by clouds of skirmishers, Meade and Gibbon advanced in column of brigades at 300 paces distance, the whole covering a front of 1,000 yards, and the supporting divisions moved up to the Richmond road. When the Federals reached the scene of their former repulse, Jackson's guns again opened, but without the same effect, for they were now exposed to the fire of the enemy's batteries at close range. Even Pelham could do but little, and the artillery beyond the railroad on Hill's left was quickly driven in. Meade's rear brigade was now brought up and deployed on the left of the first in the direction of the Massaponax, thus further extending the front. The leading brigade made straight for the tongue of woodland which interposed between Lane and Archer. As they neared the Confederate line, the Pennsylvanians, masked by the trees, found that they were no longer exposed to fire and that the coppice was unoccupied. Quickly crossing the border, through swamp and undergrowth they pushed their way, and bursting from the covert to the right, fell on the exposed flank of Lane's brigade. The fight was fierce, but the Southerners were compelled to give ground, for neither Archer nor Gregg was able to lend assistance. Meade's second brigade, though following close upon the first, had, instead of conforming to the change of direction against Lane's flank, rushed forward through the wood. 200 paces from the embankment it came in contact with Archer's left, which was resting on the very edge of the coppice. The Confederates were taken by surprise. Their front was secured by a strong skirmish line, but on the flank, as the thickets appeared impenetrable, neither scouts nor pickets had been thrown out, and the men were lying with arms piled. 2 regiments, leaping to their feet and attempting to form line to the left, were broken by a determined charge and gave way in disorder. The remainder, however, stood firm, for the Federals, instead of following up their success in this direction, left Archer to be dealt with by the 3rd Brigade of the division, which had now reached the railroad and swept on towards the military road, where Gregg's brigade was drawn up within the forest. So thick was the cover, and so limited the view, that General Gregg, taking the advancing mass for part of Archer's line retiring, restrained the fire of his men. The Federals broke upon his right. He himself fell mortally wounded. His flank regiment, a battalion of conscripts, fled, except one company, without firing a shot. The 2 regiments on the opposite flank, however, were with great readiness turned about and, changing front inwards, arrested the movement of the enemy along the rear. The Federals had now been joined by a portion of the 1st Brigade, inspirited by their victory over Lane, and the moment, to all appearance, seemed critical in the extreme for the Confederates. To the left rear of the attacking column, Meade's 3rd Brigade was held in check by Walker's batteries and the sturdy Archer, who, notwithstanding that a strong force had passed beyond his flank and had routed 2 of his regiments, still resolutely held his ground and prevented his immediate opponents from joining the intruding column. To the right rear, opposite Pender, Gibbon's division had been checked by the fire of the great battery near Bernard's cabin. 2 of his brigades had been driven back, and the 3rd had with difficulty gained the shelter of the embankment. So from neither left nor right was immediate support to be expected by Meade's victorious regiments. But on the Richmond road were the divisions of Birney and Newton, with Doubledays and Sickles not far in rear, and 20,000 bayonets might have been thrown rapidly into the gap which the Pennsylvanians had so vigorously forced. Yet Jackson's equanimity was undisturbed. The clouds of smoke and the thick timber hid the fighting in the centre from his post of observation on Prospect Hill, and the first intimation of the enemy's success was brought by an aide-de-camp galloping wildly up the slope. "General," he exclaimed in breathless haste, "the enemy have broken through Archer's left, and General Gregg says he must have help, or he and General Archer will both lose their position." Jackson turned round quietly, and without the least trace of excitement in either voice or manner, sent orders to Early and Taliaferro in 3rd line to advance with the bayonet and clear the front. Then, with rare self-restraint, for the fighting instinct was strong within him, and the danger was so threatening as to have justified his personal interference, he raised his field glasses and resumed his scrutiny of the enemy's reserves on the Richmond road. 1:45 p.m. His confidence in his lieutenants was not misplaced. Early's division, already deployed in line, came forward with a rush, and the Stonewall Brigade, responding with alacrity to Jackson's summons, led the advance of Taliaferro. The counterstroke was vigorous. Meade's brigades had penetrated to the heart of the Confederate position, but their numbers were reduced to less than 2,000 bayonets. In the fierce fighting and dense thickets they had lost all semblance of cohesion, and not a single regiment had supported them. The men looked round in vain for help, and the forest around them resounded with the yells of the Confederate reinforcements. Assailed in front and flank by a destructive fire, the Pennsylvanians were rapidly borne back. Hill's 2nd line joined in Early's advance. Gibbon was strongly attacked. 6 brigades, sweeping forward from the forest, dashed down the slopes, and in a few moments the broken remnants of the Federal divisions were dispersing in panic across the plain. As the enemy fled, the Confederate gunners, disregarding the shells of Franklin's batteries, poured a heavy fire into the receding mass, and although instructions had been given that the counterstroke was not to pass the railroad, Hoke's and Atkinson's brigades, carried away by success and deaf to all orders, followed in swift pursuit. Some of Birney's regiments, tardily coming forward to Meade's support, were swept away, and the yelling line of grey infantry, shooting down the fugitives and taking many prisoners, pressed on towards the Richmond road. There the remainder of Birney's division was drawn up, protected by the Brest High Bank and flanked by artillery. Yet it seemed for a moment as if the two Confederate brigades would carry all before them. The troops of Meade and Gibbon were streaming in confusion to the rear. 2 batteries had been abandoned, and before Hake's onset, the left of Birney's infantry gave ground for 50 yards. But the rash advance had reached its climax. Unsupported and with empty cartridge boxes, the Southerners were unable to face the fire from the road. 16 guns had opened on them with canister, and after suffering heavy losses in killed, wounded, and prisoners, they withdrew in disorder but unpursued. The success of the Second Army Corps was greater than even Jackson realized. Meade and Gibbon had lost 4,000 officers and men, and it was not till late in the afternoon that they were rallied on the riverbank. The casualties in Birney's division swelled the total to 5,000, and the Confederate counterstroke had inflicted a heavier blow than the tale of losses indicates. Not only the troops which had been engaged, but those who had witnessed their defeat, who had seen them enter the enemy's position, and who knew they should have been supported, were much disheartened. 2:30 p.m. At 2:30 p.m., soon after the repulse of Hake and Atkinson, Burnside, having just witnessed the signal failure of a 4th assault on Longstreet, sent an urgent order to Franklin to renew his attack. Franklin made no response. He had lost all confidence both in his superior and his men, and he took upon himself to disobey. On the Confederate side, Taliaferro and Early, with part of the Light Division, now held the railway embankment and the skirt of the woods. D.H. Hill was brought up into the third line, and the shattered brigades of A.P. Hill were withdrawn to the rear. During the rest of the afternoon, the skirmishers were actively engaged, but although Jackson's victorious soldiery long and eagerly expected a renewal of the assault, the enemy refused to be again tempted to close quarters. On the left, meanwhile, where the battle still raged, the Confederates were equally successful. Against an impregnable position, 40,000 Northerners were madly hurled by the general of Mr. Lincoln's choice. By those hapless and stout-hearted soldiers, sacrificed to incompetency, a heroism was displayed which won the praise and the pity of their opponents. The attack was insufficiently prepared and feebly supported by the artillery. The troops were formed on a narrow front. Mary's Hill, the strongest portion of the position, where the Confederate infantry found shelter behind a stout stone wall and numerous batteries occupied the commanding ground in rear, was selected for assault. Neither feint nor demonstration, the ordinary expedients by which the attacker seeks to distract the attention and confuse the efforts of the defence, was made use of. And yet division after division, with no abatement of courage, marched in good order over the naked plain, dashed forward with ever-thinning ranks, and then, receding sullenly before the storm of fire, left, within 100 yards of the stone wall, a long line of writhing forms to mark the limit of their advance. 2 army corps had been repulsed by Longstreet with fearful slaughter when Meade and Gibbon gave way before Jackson's counterstroke, and by 3 o'clock nearly 1/2 of the Federal army was broken and demoralized. The time appeared to have come for a general advance of the Confederates. Before Fredericksburg, the wreck of Sumner's Grand Division was still clinging to such cover as the ground afforded. On the Richmond road, in front of Jackson, Franklin had abandoned all idea of the offensive and was bringing up his last reserves to defend his line. The Confederates, on the other hand, were in the highest spirits and had lost but few. General Lee's arrangements, however, had not included preparation for a great counterstroke, and such a movement is not easily improvised. The position had been occupied for defensive purposes alone. There was no general reserve, no large and intact force which could have moved to the attack immediately the opportunity offered. "No skill," says Longstreet, "could have marshalled our troops for offensive operations in time to meet the emergency. My line was long and over broken country, so much so that the troops could not be promptly handled in offensive operations. Jackson's corps was in mass, and could he have anticipated the result of my battle, he would have been justified in pressing Franklin to the river when the battle of the latter was lost. Otherwise, pursuit would have been as unwise as the attack he had just driven off. It is well known that after driving off attacking forces, if immediate pursuit can be made, so that the victors can go along with the retreating forces pell-mell, it is well enough to do so, but the attack should be immediate. To follow a success by counter-attack against the enemy in position is problematical. Moreover, so large was the battlefield, so limited the view by reason of the woods, and with such ease had the Federal attacks been repulsed, that General Lee was unaware of the extent of his success. Ignorant, too, as he necessarily was, of the mistrust and want of confidence in its leaders with which the Federal army was infected, he was far from suspecting what a strong ally he had in the hearts of his enemies, while, on the other hand, the inaccessible batteries on the Stafford Heights were an outward and visible token of unabated strength. Jackson, however, although the short winter day was already closing in, considered that the attempt was worth making. About 3 p.m., he had seen a feeble attack on the Confederate centre repulsed by Hood and Pender, and about the same time he received information of Longstreet's success. Franklin, meanwhile, was reforming his lines behind the high banks of the Richmond road, and the approach of his reserves, plainly visible from the Confederate position, seemed to presage a renewed attack. "I waited some time," says Jackson, "to receive it, but he making no forward movement, I determined, if prudent, to do so myself. The artillery of the enemy was so judiciously posted as to make an advance of our troops across the plain very hazardous, yet it was so promising of good results, if successfully executed, as to induce me to make preparations for the attempt. In order to guard against disaster, the infantry was to be preceded by artillery, and the movement postponed until late in the afternoon, so that if compelled to retire, it would be under cover of the night." Jackson's decision was not a little influenced by Stuart, or rather by the reports which Stuart, who had sent out staff officers to keep the closest watch on the enemy's movements, had been able to furnish of the demoralized condition of a great part of Franklin's force. The cavalry general, as soon as he verified the truth of these reports in person, galloped off to confer with Jackson on Prospect Hill, and a message was at once sent to Lee requesting permission for an advance. A single cannon shot was to be the signal for a general attack, which Stuart, striking the enemy in flank, was to initiate with his 2 brigades and the lighter guns. "Returning to our position," to quote Stuart's chief of staff, "we awaited in anxious silence the desired signal, but minute after minute passed by, and the dark veil of the winter night began to envelop the valley, when Stuart, believing that the summons agreed upon had been given, issued the order to advance. Off we went into the gathering darkness, our sharpshooters driving their opponents easily before them, and Pelham with his guns, pushing ahead at a trot, giving them a few shots whenever the position seemed favourable, and then again pressing forward. This lasted about 20 minutes, when the fire of the enemy's infantry began to be more and more destructive, and other fresh batteries opened upon us. Still all remained silent upon our main line. Our situation had become, indeed, a critical one, when a courier from General Jackson galloped up at full speed, bringing the order for Stuart to retreat as quickly as he could to his original position. Under cover of the night, this retrograde movement was effected without loss, and the cavalry, as they marched back, saw the campfires kindling on the skirts of the forest, and the infantry digging entrenchments by the fitful glare. The Second Corps had not come into action. Jackson had issued orders that every gun, of whatever calibre or range, which was not disabled, should be brought to the front and open fire at sunset, and that as soon as the enemy showed signs of wavering, the infantry should charge with fixed bayonets and sweep the invaders into the river. Hood's division, which had been temporarily placed at his disposal, was instructed to cooperate. It appears, however, that it had not been easy, in the short space of daylight still available, to remedy the confusion into which the Confederates had been thrown by Meade's attack and their own counterstroke. The divisions were to some extent mixed up. Several regiments had been broken, and the ammunition of both infantry and artillery needed replenishment. Moreover, it was difficult in the extreme to bring the batteries forward through the forest, and when they eventually arrived, the strength of the Federal position was at once revealed. Franklin's line was defended by 116 field pieces, generally of superior metal to those of the Confederates, and the guns on the Stafford Heights, of which at least 30 bore upon Jackson's front, were still in action. As the first Confederate battery advanced, this great array of artillery, which had been for some time comparatively quiet, reopened with vigour, and, to use Jackson's words, so completely swept our front as to satisfy me that the proposed movement should be abandoned. But he was not yet at the end of his resources. A strong position, which cannot be turned, is not always impregnable. If the ground be favourable and few obstacles exist, a night attack with the bayonet, especially if the enemy be exhausted or half-beaten, has many chances of success. And during the evening Jackson made arrangements for such a movement. He asked me, says Dr. Maguire, how many yards of bandaging I had, and when I replied that I did not know the exact number, but that I had enough for another fight, he seemed a little worried at my lack of information and showed his annoyance. I repeated rather shortly, "I have enough for another battle," meaning to imply that this was all that it was necessary for him to know. I then asked him, "Why do you want to know how much bandaging I have?" He said, "I want a yard of bandaging to put on the arm of every soldier in this night's attack, so that the men may know each other from the enemy." I told him I had not enough cotton cloth for any such purpose, and that he would have to take a piece of the shirt-tail of each soldier to supply the cloth. But, unfortunately, half of them had no shirts. The expedient was never tried. General Lee decided that the attack would be too hazardous. That night both armies lay on their arms. Burnside, notwithstanding that he spent several hours amongst the troops before Fredericksburg, and found that both officers and men were opposed to further attack, decided to renew the battle the next day. His arrangements became known to Lee, an officer or orderly carrying dispatches having strayed within the Confederate outposts, and the Southern generals looked forward, on the morning of the 14th, to a fresh attack, a more crushing repulse, and a general counterstroke. Such cheerful anticipations, however, so often entertained by generals holding a strong defensive position, are but seldom realized, and Fredericksburg was no exception. The Confederates spent the night in diligent preparation. Supplies of ammunition were brought up and distributed, the existing defences were repaired, abatis cut and laid, and fresh earthworks thrown up. Jackson, as usual on the eve of battle, was still working while others rested. Until near midnight he sat up writing and dispatching orders. Then, throwing himself, booted and spurred, on his camp bed, he slept for 2 or 3 hours, when he again arose, lighted his candle, and resumed his writing. Before 4 o'clock he sent to his medical director to inquire as to the condition of General Gregg. Dr. Maguire reported that his case was hopeless, and Jackson requested that he would go over and see that he had everything he wished. Somewhat against his will, for there were many wounded who required attention, the medical officer rode off, but scarcely had he entered the farmhouse where Gregg was lying than he heard the tramp of horses, and Jackson himself dismounted on the threshold. The brigadier, it appears, had lately fallen under the ban of his displeasure, but from the moment his condition was reported, Jackson forgot everything but the splendid services he had rendered on so many hard-fought fields, and in his anxiety that every memory should be effaced which might embitter his last moments, he had followed Dr. Maguire to his bedside. The interview was brief, and the dying soldier was the happier for it, but the scene in that lonely Virginian homestead, where, in the dark hours of the chill December morning, the life of a strong man, of a gallant comrade, of an accomplished gentleman, and of an unselfish patriot, for Gregg was all these, was slowly ebbing, made a deeper impression on those who witnessed it than the accumulated horrors of the battlefield. Sadly and silently the general and his staff officer rode back through the forest, where the troops were already stirring round the smouldering campfires. Their thoughts were sombre. The Confederacy, with a relatively slender population, could ill spare such men as Gregg. And yet Jackson, though yielding to the depression of the moment and deploring the awful sacrifices which the defence of her liberties imposed upon the South, was in no melting mood. Dr. Maguire, when they reached headquarters, put a question as to the best means of coping with the overwhelming numbers of the enemy. "Kill them, sir! Kill every man!" was the reply of the stern soldier, who but just now, with words of tender sympathy and Christian hope, had bade farewell to his dying comrade. But on December 14th, as on the morrow of Sharpsburg, the Confederates were doomed to disappointment. "Darkness still prevailed," writes Stuart's chief of the staff, "when we mounted our horses and again hastened to Prospect Hill, the summit of which we reached just in time to see the sun rising and unveiling, as it dispersed the haze, the long lines of the Federal army, which once more stood in full line of battle between our own position and the river. I could not withhold my admiration as I looked down upon the well-disciplined ranks of our antagonists, astonished that these troops now offering so bold a front should be the same whom not many hours since I had seen in complete flight and disorder. The skirmishers of the two armies were not much more than 100 yards apart, concealed from each other's view by the high grass in which they were lying, and above which, from time to time, rose a small cloud of blue smoke, telling that a shot had been fired. As the boom of artillery began to sound from different parts of the line, and the attack might be expected every minute, each hastened to his post. But though the skirmishing at times grew hotter, and the fire of the artillery more rapid, long intervals of silence succeeded, until it at length became apparent to the Confederates that the enemy, though well prepared to resist attack, was determined not to fight outside his breastworks. Burnside, indeed, giving way to the remonstrances of his subordinates, had abandoned all idea of further aggressive action, and unless Lee should move forward, had determined to recross the Potomac. Decrant 15. The next morning saw the armies in the same positions, and the Federal wounded, many of whom had been struck down nearly 48 hours before, still lying untended between the hostile lines. It was not till now that Burnside admitted his defeat by sending a flag of truce with a request that he might be allowed to bury his dead. The same night a fierce storm swept the valley of the Rappahannock, and the Army of the Potomac repassed the bridges, evading, under cover of the elements, the observation of the Confederate patrols. The retreat was effected with a skill which did much credit to the Federal staff. Within 14 hours, 100,000 troops, with the whole of their guns, ambulances, and ammunition wagons, were conveyed across the Rappahannock, but there remained on the south bank sufficient evidence to show that the Army of the Potomac had not escaped unscathed. When the morning broke, the dead lay thick upon the field. Arms and accoutrements, the debris of defeat, were strewed in profusion on every hand, and the ruined houses of Fredericksburg were filled with wounded. Burnside lost in the battle 12,647 men. No attempt was made by the Confederates to follow the enemy across the Rappahannock. The upper fords were open, but the river was rising fast, and the Army of the Potomac, closely concentrated and within a few miles of Aquia Creek, was too large to be attacked, and too close to its base to permit effective manoeuvres, which might induce it to divide against its line of communications. The exultation of the Southern soldiers in their easy victory was dashed by disappointment. Burnside's escape had demonstrated the fallacy of one of the so-called rules of war. The great river which lay behind him during the Battle of Fredericksburg had proved his salvation instead of, as it theoretically should, his ruin. Over the 6 bridges his troops had more lines of retreat than is usually the case when roads only are available, and these lines of retreat were secure, protected from the Confederate cavalry by the river, and from the infantry and artillery by the batteries on the Stafford Heights. Had the battle been fought on the North Anna, 36 miles from Fredericksburg, the result might have been very different. A direct counterstroke would possibly have been no more practicable than on the Rappahannock, for the superior numbers of the enemy and his powerful artillery could not have been disregarded. nor would a direct pursuit have been a certain means of making success decisive. The rear of a retreating army, as the Confederates had found to their cost at Malvern Hill, is usually its strongest part. But a pursuit directed against the flanks, striking the line of retreat, cutting off the supply and ammunition trains, and blocking the roads, a pursuit such as Jackson had organised when he drove Banks from the valley, if conducted with vigour, seldom fails in its effect. And who would have conducted such an operation with greater skill and energy than Stuart at the head of his 9,000 horsemen? Who would have supported Stuart more expeditiously than the foot cavalry of the Second Army Corps? Lee's position at Fredericksburg, strong as it might appear, was exceedingly disadvantageous. A position which an army occupies with a view to decisive battle should fulfil 4 requirements. It should not be too strong, or the enemy will not attack it. It should give cover to the troops both from view and fire from artillery, and have a good field of fire. It should afford facilities for counterstroke. It should afford facilities for pursuit. Of these Lee's battlefield fulfilled but the first and second. It would have been an admirable selection if the sole object of the Confederates had been to gain time, or to prevent the enemy establishing himself south of the Rappahannock. But to encompass the destruction of the enemy's whole army, it was as ill-adapted as Wellington's position at Torres Vedras, at Busaco, or at Fuentes d'Honor. But while Wellington, in taking up these positions, had no further end in view than holding the French in check, the situation of the Confederacy was such that a decisive victory was eminently desirable. Nothing was to be gained by gaining time. The South could furnish Lee with no further reinforcements. Every able-bodied man was in the service of his country, and it was perfectly certain that the Western armies, although they had been generally successful during the past year, would never be permitted by Mr. Davis to leave the valley of the Mississippi. The Army of Northern Virginia was not likely to be stronger or more efficient. Equipped with the spoils of many victorias, it was more on a level with the enemy than had hitherto been the case. The ranks were full. The men were inured to hardships and swift marches. Their health was proof against inclement weather, and they knew their work on the field of battle. The artillery had recently been reorganized. During the Peninsular Campaign, the batteries had been attached to the infantry brigades, and the indifferent service they had often rendered had been attributed to the difficulty of collecting the scattered units and in handling them in combination. Formed into battalions of 4 or 6 batteries, a large number of guns was now attached to each of the divisions, and each army corps had a strong reserve, so that the concentration of a heavy force of artillery on any part of a position became a feasible operation. The cavalry, so admirably commanded by Stuart, Hampton, and the younger Lees, was not less hardy or efficient than the infantry, and the moral of the soldiers of every arm, founded on confidence in themselves, not less than on confidence in their leaders, was never higher. After the truce had been agreed upon, says Captain Smith, litter-bearers to bring away the dead and wounded were selected from the command of General Boades. When they had fallen in, General Boades said to them, "Now, boys, those Yankees are going to ask you questions, and you must not tell them anything. Be very careful about this." At this juncture one of the men spoke up and said, "General, can't we tell them that we whipped them yesterday?" Boades replied, laughing, Yes, you can tell them that." Immediately another man spoke up. "General, can't we tell them that we can whip them tomorrow and the day after?" Boades again laughed, and sent those incorrigible jokers off with, Yes, go on, tell them what you please." The Army of the Potomac, on the other hand, was not likely to become weaker or less formidable if time were allowed it to recuperate. It had behind it enormous reserves. 60,000 men had been killed, wounded, or captured since the Battle of Kernstown, and yet the ranks were as full as when McClellan first marched on Richmond. Many generals had disappeared, but those who remained were learning their trade, and the soldiers, although more familiar with defeat than victory, showed little diminution of martial ardour. Nor had the strain of the war sapped the resources of the North. Her trade, instead of dwindling, had actually increased. and the gaps made in the population by the Confederate bullets were more than made good by a constant influx of immigrants from Europe. It was not by partial triumphs, not by the slaughter of a few brigades, by defence without counterstroke, by victories without pursuit, that a power of such strength and vitality could be compelled to confess her impotence. Whether some overwhelming disaster, a Jena or a Waterloo, followed by instant invasion, would have subdued her stubborn spirit is problematical. Rome survived Cannae, Scotland Flodden, and France Sedan. But in some such crowning mercy lay the only hope of the Confederacy, and had the Army of the Potomac, ill-commanded as it was, been drawn forward to the North Anna, it might have been utterly destroyed. Half-hearted strategy, which aims only at repulsing the enemy's attack, is not the path to king-making victory. It is not by such feeble means that states secure or protect their independence. To occupy a position where Stuart's cavalry was powerless, where the qualities which made Lee's infantry so formidable, the impetuosity of their attack, the swiftness of their marches, had no field for display, and where the enemy had free scope for the employment of his artillery, his strongest arm, was but to postpone the evil day. It had been well for the Confederacy if Stonewall Jackson, whose resolute strategy had but one aim, and that aim the annihilation of the enemy, had been the supreme director of her counsels. To paraphrase Mahan, the strategic mistake, in occupying a position for which pursuit was impracticable, neutralized the tactical advantage gained, thus confirming the military maxim that a strategic mistake is more serious and far-reaching in its effects than an error in tactics. Lee, however, was fettered by the orders of the Cabinet, and Mr. Davis and his advisers, more concerned with the importance of retaining an area of country which still furnished supplies than of annihilating the Army of the Potomac, and relying on European intervention rather than on the valour of the Southern soldier, were responsible for the occupation of the Fredericksburg position. In extenuation of their mistake, it may, however, be admitted that the advantages of concentration on the North Anna were not such as would impress themselves on the civilian mind, while the surrender of territory would undoubtedly have embarrassed both the government and the supply department. Moreover, at the end of November, it might have been urged that if Burnside were permitted to possess himself of Fredericksburg, it was by no means certain that he would advance on Richmond. Establishing himself in winter quarters, he might wait until the weather improved, controlling in the meantime the resources and population of that portion of Virginia which lay within his reach. Nevertheless, as events went far to prove, Mr. Davis would have done wisely had he accepted the advice of the soldiers on the spot. His strategical glance was less comprehensive than that of Lee and Jackson. In the first place, they knew that if Burnside proposed going into winter quarters, he would not deliberately place the Rappahannock between himself and his base, nor halt with the great forest of Spotsylvania on his flank. In the second place, there could be no question but that the Northern government and the Northern people would impel him forward. The tone of the press was unmistakable, and the very reason that Burnside had been appointed to command was because McClellan was so slow to move. In the third place, both Lee and Jackson saw the need of decisive victory. With them questions of strategic dispositions, offering chances of such victory, were of more importance than questions of supply or internal politics. They knew with what rapidity the Federal soldiers recovered their morale, and they realized but too keenly the stern determination which inspired the North. They had seen the hosts of invasion retire in swift succession, stricken and exhausted, before their victorious bayonets. Thousands of prisoners had been marched to Richmond. Thousands of wounded, abandoned on the battlefield, had been paroled. Guns, wagons, and small arms, enough to equip a great army, had been captured, and general after general had been reduced to the ignominy that awaits a defeated leader. Fremont and Shields had disappeared. Banks was no longer in the field. Porter was waiting trial. McDowell had gone. Pope had gone, and McClellan. And yet the Army of the Potomac still held its ground. The great fleets still kept their stations. The capture of Richmond was still the objective of the Union government, and not for a single moment had Lincoln wavered from his purpose. It will not be asserted that either Lee or Jackson fathomed the source of this unconquerable tenacity. They had played with effect on the fears of Lincoln. They had recognized in him the motive power of the Federal hosts. But they had not yet learned, for the Northern people themselves had not yet learned it, that they were opposed by an adversary whose resolution was as unyielding as their own, who loved the Union even as they loved Virginia, and who ruled the nation with the same tact and skill that they ruled their soldiers. In these pages, Mr. Lincoln has not been spared. He made mistakes, and he himself would have been the last to claim infallibility. He had entered the White House with a rich endowment of common sense, a high sense of duty, and an extraordinary knowledge of the American character. But his ignorance of statesmanship directing arms was great, and his military errors were numerous. Putting these aside, his tenure of office during the dark days of 61 and 62 had been marked by the very highest political sagacity. His courage and his patriotism had sustained the nation in its distress. And in spite of every obstacle, he was gradually bringing into being a unity of sympathy and of purpose, which in the early days of the war had seemed an impossible ideal. Not the least politic of his measures was the Edict of Emancipation, published after the Battle of Sharpsburg. It was not a measure without flaw. It contained paragraphs which might fairly be interpreted, and were so interpreted by the Confederates, as inciting the Negroes to rise against their masters, thus exposing to all the horrors of a servile insurrection, with its accompaniments of murder and outrage, the farms and plantations where the women and children of the South lived lonely and unprotected. But if the edict served only to embitter the Southerners, to bind the whole country together in a still closer league of resistance, and to make peace except by conquest impossible, it was worth the price. The party in the North, which fought for the re-establishment of the Union, had carried on the war with but small success. The tale of reverses had told at last upon recruiting. Men were unwilling to come forward, and those who were bribed by large bounties to join the armies were of a different character to the original volunteer. Enthusiasm in the cause was fast diminishing when Lincoln, purely on his own initiative, proclaimed emancipation and, investing the war with the dignity of a crusade, inspired the soldier with a new incentive and appealed to a feeling which had not yet been stirred. Many Northerners had not thought it worth while to fight for the re-establishment of the Union on the basis of the Constitution. If slavery was to be permitted to continue, they preferred separation, and these men were farmers and agriculturists, the class which furnished the best soldiers, men of American birth, for the most part abolitionists, and ready to fight for the principle they had so much at heart. It is true that the effect of the edict was not at once apparent. It was not received everywhere with acclamation. The army had small sympathy with the coloured race, and the political opponents of the president accused him vehemently of unconstitutional action. Their denunciations, however, missed the mark. The letter of the Constitution, as Mr. Lincoln clearly saw, had ceased to be regarded, at least by the great bulk of the people, with superstitious reverence. They had learned to think more of great principles than of political expedients, and if the defence of their hereditary rights had welded the South into a nation, the assertion of a still nobler principle, the liberty of man, placed the North on a higher plane, enlisted the sympathy of Europe, and completed the isolation of the Confederacy. But although Lee and Jackson had not yet penetrated the political genius of their great antagonist, they rated at its true value the vigour displayed by his administration, and they saw that something more was wanting to wrest their freedom from the North than a mere passive resistance to the invaders' progress. Soon after the Battle of Fredericksburg, Lee went to Richmond and laid proposals for an aggressive campaign before the president. He was assured, however, says General Longstreet, that the war was virtually over and that we need not harass our troops by marches and other hardships. Gold had advanced in New York to 200 premium, and we were told by those in the Confederate capital that in 30 or 40 days we would be recognized by the European powers and peace proclaimed. General Lee did not share this belief. Section 18. So Jackson, who had hoped to return to Winchester, was doomed to. the inaction of winter quarters on the Rappahannock, for with Burnside's repulse operations practically ceased. The Confederate cavalry, however, did not at once abandon hostilities. On December 18th, Hampton marched his brigade as far as the village of Occoquan, bringing off 150 prisoners and capturing a convoy. Decian 26. And on December 26th, Stuart closed his record for 1862 by leading 1,800 troopers far to the Federal rear. After doing much damage in the district about Occoquan and Dumfries, 20 miles from Burnside's headquarters, he marched northward in the direction of Washington and penetrated as far as Burke's Station, 15 miles from Alexandria. Sending a telegraphic message to General Meigs, Quartermaster General at Washington, to the effect that the mules furnished to Burnside's army were of such bad quality that he was embarrassed in taking the wagons he had captured into the Confederate lines, and requesting that a better class of animal might be supplied in future, he returned by long marches through Warrenton to Culpeper Courthouse, escaping pursuit and bringing with him a large amount of plunder and many prisoners. From the afternoon of December 26th to nightfall on December 31st, he rode 150 miles, losing 28 officers and men in skirmishes with detachments of the Federal cavalry. He had contrived to throw a great part of the troops sent to meet him into utter confusion by intercepting their telegrams, and answering them himself in a manner that scattered his pursuers and broke down their horses. Near the end of January, Burnside made a futile attempt to march his army round Lee's flank by way of Ely's and Germanna fords. The weather, however, was inclement, the roads were in a fearful condition, and the troops experienced such difficulty in movement that the operation, which goes by the name of the Mud Campaign, was soon abandoned. 1863. January 26. On January 26th, Burnside, in consequence of the strong representations made by his lieutenants to the President, was superseded. General Hooker, the dashing fighter of the Antietam, replaced him in command of the Army of the Potomac, and the Federal troops went into winter quarters about Falmouth, where, on the opposite shore of the Rappahannock, within full view of the sentries, stood a row of finger-posts on which the Confederate soldiers had painted the taunting legend, "This way to Richmond." Chapter 21. The Army of Northern Virginia. In war men are nothing. It is the man who is everything. The general is the head, the whole of an army. It was not the Roman army that conquered Gaul, but Caesar. It was not the Carthaginian army that made Rome tremble in her gates, but Hannibal. It was not the Macedonian army that reached the Indus, but Alexander. It was not the French army that carried the war to the Weser and the Inn, but Turenne. It was not the Prussian army which for 7 years defended Prussia against the 3 greatest powers of Europe, but Frederick the Great. So spoke Napoleon, reiterating a truth confirmed by the experience of successive ages, that a wise direction is of more avail than overwhelming numbers, sound strategy than the most perfect armament, a powerful will, invigorating all who come within its sphere, than the spasmodic efforts of ill-regulated valour. Even a professional army of long-standing and old traditions is what its commander makes it. Its character sooner or later becomes the reflex of his own. From him the officers take their tone. His energy or his inactivity, his firmness or vacillation are rapidly communicated even to the lower ranks. And so far-reaching is the influence of the leader that those who record his campaigns concern themselves but little as a rule with the men who followed him. The history of famous armies is the history of great generals, for no army has ever achieved great things unless it has been well commanded. If the general be second-rate, the army also will be second-rate. Mutual confidence is the basis of success in war, and unless the troops have implicit trust in the resolution and resources of their chief, hesitation and half-heartedness are sure to mark their actions. They may fight with their accustomed courage, but the eagerness for the conflict, the alacrity to support, the determination to conquer, will not be there. The indefinable quality which is expressed by the word moral will to some degree be affected. The history of the Army of the Potomac is a case in point. Between the soldiers of the North and South there was little difference. Neither could claim a superiority of martial qualities. The Confederates, indeed, at the beginning of the war possessed a larger measure of technical skill. They were the better shots and the finer riders. But they were neither braver nor more enduring, and while they probably derived some advantage from the fact that they were defending their homes, the Federals, defending the integrity of their native land, were fighting in the noblest of all causes. But Northerner and Southerner were of the same race, a race proud, resolute, independent. Both were inspired by the same sentiments of self-respect. Noblesse oblige, the noblesse of a free people, was the motto of the one as of the other. It has been asserted that the Federal armies were very largely composed of foreigners, whose motives for enlisting were purely mercenary. At no period of the war, however, did the proportion of Native Americans sink below 70%, and at the beginning of 1863 it was much greater. As a matter of fact, the Union Army was composed of thoroughly staunch soldiers. Nor was the alien element at this time a source of weakness. Ireland and Germany supplied the greater number of those who have been called Lincoln's hirelings, and, judging from the official records, the Irish regiments at least were not a whit less trustworthy than those purely American. Moreover, even if the admixture of foreigners had been greater, the Army of the Potomac, for the reason that it was always superior in numbers, contained in its ranks many more men bred in the United States than the Army of Northern Virginia. For the consistent ill success of the Federals, the superior marksmanship and finer horsemanship of the Confederates cannot therefore be accepted as sufficient explanation. In defence, the balance of endurance inclined neither to one side nor the other. Both Southerner and Northerner displayed that stubborn resolve to maintain their ground, which is the peculiar attribute of the Anglo-Saxon. To claim for any one race a preeminence of valour is repugnant alike to good taste and to sound sense. Courage and endurance are widely distributed over the world's surface, and political institutions, the national conception of duty, the efficiency of the cause of officers and love of country, are the foundation of vigour and staunchness in the field. Yet it is a fact which can hardly be ignored that from Crécy to Inkerman there have been exceedingly few instances where an English army, large or small, has been driven from a position. In the great struggle with France, neither Napoleon nor his marshals, although the armies of every other European nation had fled before them, could boast of having broken the English infantry, and no soldiers have ever received a prouder tribute than the admission of a generous enemy. They never know when they are beaten. In America, the characteristics of the parent race were as prominent in the Civil War as they had been in the Revolution. In 1861 and 65, the side that stood on the defensive, unless hopelessly outnumbered, was almost invariably successful, just as it had been in 1776-82. "My men," said Jackson, "sometimes fail to drive the enemy from his position, but to hold one, never." The Federal generals might have made the same assertion with almost equal truth. Porter had indeed been defeated at Gaines's Mill, but he could only set 35,000 in line against 55,000. Banks had been overwhelmed at Winchester, but 6,500 men could hardly have hoped to resist more than twice their strength, and Shields' advanced guard at Port Republic was much inferior to the force which Jackson brought against it. Yet these were the only offensive victories of the 62 campaign. But if in defence the armies were well matched, it must be conceded that the northern attack was not pressed with the same concentrated vigour as the southern. McClellan at Sharpsburg had more than twice as many men as Lee. Pope, on the first day of the Second Manassas, twice as many as Jackson. Yet on both occasions the smaller force was victorious. But in the first place, the Federal tactics in attack were always feeble. Lincoln, in appointing Hooker to command the Army of the Potomac, warned him to put in all his men. His sharp eye had detected the great fault which had characterized the operations of his generals. Their assaults had been piecemeal, like those of the Confederates at Malvern Hill, and they had been defeated in detail by the inferior numbers. The Northern soldiers were strangers to those general and combined attacks, pressed with unyielding resolution, which had won Winchester, Gaines's Mill, and the 2nd Manassas, and which had nearly won Kernstown. The Northern generals invariably kept large masses in reserve, and these masses were never used. They had not yet learned, as had Lee, Jackson, and Longstreet, that superior numbers are of no avail unless they are brought into action, impelling the attack forward by sheer weight at the decisive point. In the second place, none of the Federal leaders possessed the entire confidence either of their generals or their troops. With all its affection for McClellan, it may strongly be questioned whether his army gave him credit for dash or resolution. Pope was defeated in his first action at Cedar Run. Banks at Winchester, Fremont west of Staunton, had both been outmanoeuvred. Burnside had against him his feeble conduct at Sharpsburg. Hence the Federal soldiers fought most of their offensive battles under a terrible disadvantage. They were led by men who had known defeat, and who owed their defeat, in great measure, to the same fault, neglect to employ their whole force in combination. Brave and unyielding as they were, the troops went into battle mistrustful of their leaders' skill, and fearful from the very outset that their efforts would be unsupported. And when men begin to look over their shoulders for reinforcements, demoralization is not far off. It would be untrue to say that a defeated general can never regain the confidence of his soldiers. But unless he has previous successes to set off against his failure, to permit him to retain his position, is dangerous in the extreme. Such was the opinion of Jackson, always solicitous of the moral of his command. To his mind, nothing ever fully excused failure, and it was rarely that he gave an officer the opportunity of failing twice. "The service," he said, "cannot afford to keep a man who does not succeed." Nor was he ever restrained from a change by the fear of making matters worse. His motto was, "Get rid of the unsuccessful man at once, and trust to Providence for finding a better." Nor was the presence of discredited generals the only evil which went to neutralize the valor of the Federal soldiers. The system of command was as rotten in the Army of the Potomac as in the armies of Northern Virginia, and of the Valley it was sound. And the system of command plays a most important part in war. The natural initiative of the American, the general fearlessness of responsibility, were as conspicuous among the soldiers as in the nation at large. To those familiar with the official records, where the doings of regiments and even companies are preserved, it is perfectly apparent that, so soon as the officers gained experience, the smaller units were as boldly and efficiently handled as in the Army of Germany under Moltke. But while Lee and Jackson, by every means in their power, fostered the capacity for independent action, following therein the example of Napoleon, of Washington, of Nelson, and of Wellington, and aware that their strength would thus be doubled, McClellan and Pope did their best to stifle it, and in the higher ranks they succeeded. In the one case, the generals were taught to wait for orders, in the other to anticipate them. In the one case, where the troops were supported or not depended on the word of the commanding general. In the other, every officer was taught that to sustain his colleagues was his first duty. It thus resulted that while the Confederate leaders were served by scores of zealous assistants, actively engaged in furthering the aim of their superiors, McClellan, Pope, and Fremont, jealous of power, reduced their subordinates, with few exceptions, to the position of machines, content to obey the letter of their orders, oblivious of opportunity, and incapable of cooperation. Lee and Jackson appear to have realized the requirements of battle far more fully than their opponents. They knew that the scope of the commander is limited, that once his troops are committed to close action, it is impossible for him to exert further control, for his orders can no longer reach them, that he cannot keep the whole field under observation, much less observe every fleeting opportunity. Yet it is by utilizing opportunities that the enemy's strength is sapped. For these reasons, the Confederate generals were exceedingly careful not to chill the spirit of enterprise. Errors of judgment were never considered in the light of crimes, while the officer who, in default of orders, remained inactive, or who, when his orders were manifestly inapplicable to a suddenly changed situation, and there was no time to have them altered, dared not act for himself, was not long retained in responsible command. In the Army of the Potomac, on the other hand, centralization was the rule. McClellan expected blind obedience from his corps commanders and nothing more, and Pope brought Porter to trial for using his own judgment on occasions when Pope himself was absent during the campaign of the Second Manassas. Thus the Federal soldiers, through no fault of their own, laboured for the first 2 years of the war under a disadvantage from which the wisdom of Lee and Jackson had relieved the Confederates. The Army of the Potomac was an inert mass, the Army of Northern Virginia a living organism, endowed with irresistible vigour.